All right, guys, we're back for section 4 of this human rights course, and today we're going to talk about censorship. Okay, and censorship is it violates the human rights, or can violate, I should say, the human rights of free thought and free expression. Right? In the United States, we have the First Amendment, which guarantees, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And all of those things, all of those rights can be violated by censorship. Now, there's lots of different kinds of censorship, okay? And not all of them are bad, and not all of them violate your rights. But there are different kinds. So there's autonomous censorship, right? Where you censor yourself, i.e., there's something I really want to say, but I'm going to stop myself from saying it because, whatever reason. There's social censorship, which are essentially, the taboo things that society says we're not supposed to talk about. For instance, there's a social taboo on talking about how much money you make, which I actually really don't like. That's a taboo I think we should fight against. But then there's also social censorship on things like, well, I'll give you a great example. I had a really bad ingrown toenail a few years ago, and I was getting surgery to fix it. And I took a picture of it and posted it on social media, and people went wild. They were horribly upset that I had dared to post this picture of my toe with, essentially a stick coming out of it. But that's social censorship. It's taboo to talk about these kind of things or discuss these things or show pictures of these things. There's legal censorship, which is essentially where the government says you're not allowed to say that. And there's two different kinds. There's prior censorship and penal censorship. Prior censorship means essentially, you have to get this approved by us before you can publish it. And there's penal censorship, which is, go ahead and publish all these things, but if any of them violate our rules, we're going to punish you for it, right? There's extra-legal censorship, which is like legal censorship, but kind of subtler and outside of those two realms, right? So, like, the surveillance of terrorism suspects in the United States caused a lot of people to, not want to call and talk to their friends in foreign countries because they were afraid of the United States government overhearing the conversation. Voluntary censorship is essentially where people or groups with no legal backing make rules that for censorship of their members, right? So if your private company says you're not allowed to say this, or you're not allowed to believe that, or whatever. And then there's subterranean censorship, which is essentially where you use legally given power that was given to you for non-censorship reasons in a way that becomes censorship. For instance, a great example of this is a library. Right? So a library has the power, the legal power, to choose what books they buy and shelve, right? Because, you can't own every book, and so they have to make a choice based on, funding and what the people want and what's popular and what's not popular as to what books they should buy. But they can use that power to censor, like if a library will carry, a bunch of Bibles, but they refuse to carry the Quran or the Talmud or the Gospel of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, it can become censorship. They're able to use that power given to them for other purposes to censor. Now, this is something we're going to talk a lot about throughout the course, but no right is absolute. There is no such thing as an absolute right, okay? A lot of people in the United States really don't understand this, and they believe that freedom of speech means I can never, ever, ever face negative consequences for the things I say. That's not true at all. Okay? Not only can you face consequences for speech from other groups, and that's not a violation of your rights, you can actually face legal punishment for the things you say, and it's not a violation of your rights. The difference is your human rights are violated when that censorship is a tool to oppress you and to prevent you from exercising your human rights. When censorship doesn't reach that level, it's not a violation of your rights, right? So we it would be very, very difficult to imagine a world with no censorship at all. Where, I could say, I'm going to go kill the president, right? That is illegal in this country for what I hope are very obvious reasons. You can't threaten the life of somebody else, especially not the President of the United States, without having the authorities justifiably concerned, right? If it's a real threat, if you're just nuts or not actually intending that the threat be taken seriously, then it might not be an illegal act. But if it's a real threat, like I am going to kill this person, then of course the government has every right to censor that and investigate you for that, and essentially use their legal authority to prevent that. But it's all about that balancing act, right? So we want people to be able to speak and hear ideas and express themselves and believe what they want to believe. The question is at what exact point does that speech go too far and it should be censored? And that's a really difficult balancing act that every country that has tried to respect free speech has struggled with, especially the United States. And there's been all kinds of different great examples of how that balancing act has played out, usually through the Supreme Court, in United States history. But we need to talk a little bit about the history of censorship first. So, 1551, this guy Martin Luther, which whenever I find these portraits of these old people, I always love their facial expressions. They always just have the weirdest facial expressions, all these old things. So this is Martin Luther. He comes along and he kind of rebels against the church, right? He says, hey, I think, the church is wrong, and I think Christians should believe these other things. And that's where we get the term Lutheran, right? And they were protesting against the Catholic Church, so they were known as Protestants, people who were protesting. But he was one of the first to really come forward and say, look, the Catholic Church, I think, is wrong. Here's what we should believe instead. So his works, any written work, either by him or even about him, were banned in the Holy Roman Empire, starting in 1551. 1609, essentially the church in the early 1600s created a list. The Catholic Church says, look, these books are banned. No Catholic is allowed to read them. You can get punished by the church if you're caught with them. And in 1609, Kepler, second guy here, his works that essentially proved the heliocentric model of the solar system were put on that list. The church banned anybody learning about how the sun was the center of the solar system. 1617, England made blasphemy a crime, i.e., if you said, words against God, if you said, I don't like God, he's bad and boo, that is blasphemy, that's a crime. You can get arrested, tried, and convicted for that. 1632, back to the Catholic Church, they censor Galileo, this guy, who was doing very similar things to Kepler, right? Looking at the solar system and looking at, Saturn and its moons and talking about astronomy and how the planets move and all that stuff. And the church really took that as an attack on their beliefs that, the earth is the center of everything. The earth is obviously what God created, and, the heavens are kind of an afterthought, but earth is where you put humans, and this is really important and all that stuff. So Kepler and Galileo and Copernicus and all these other people were kind of saying that the church was wrong about that, and they got really upset and banned their works. But a really, really, really big one, 1898 in France, there was this thing called the Dreyfus Affair, and this lasted like a decade or more. Essentially, this guy, Dreyfus, was a French military officer, and he got tried and convicted and sent to prison for essentially treason, right? But the government and the military, in coordination with the media, started censoring a lot of the information about this case. And it was a long time, and it was, there were a few people who learned about the case who started trying to help this Dreyfus guy because they knew he was innocent. So the military wanted a scapegoat, and Dreyfus was Jewish. And so he made a convenient scapegoat for this crime that had actually happened. But it wasn't until many years later that they figure out, no, it was this other guy that did it, not Dreyfus. But even then, once they figured that out, the military and the media kind of brushed it under the rug. The big media personality in France at the time was very anti-Semitic. So he wanted this Jewish guy to be guilty. Because it proved, that Jews are horrible and they're traitors and all these horrible things that he'd been saying about Jewish people. It was evidence of these horrible things. So he really wanted Dreyfus to be guilty. So the military and this media group worked together to censor any information about Dreyfus and this court case and who really did it and all this evidence that showed that the military had made a mistake. But finally, eventually, the kind of the Supreme Court of France was able to get in and say, yeah, no, we have all this evidence. He didn't actually do it. You need to free him. So he did eventually get out of prison many years after being sent there. 21st century, one of the big powerhouses of censorship in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. They were masters at censoring everything in Soviet life, from pictures to newspapers to movies and radio broadcasts. They censored everything. It was an entire division of the government that was only concerned with making sure that everything that hit the media and all forms of media were kind of pro-Soviet, right? So here's a great example. This was a picture taking, I think the late 40s, early 50s, and that's Joseph Stalin and some of the people that he had around him at the time, his advisors and military people and such. But then this guy on the right here did something to upset Stalin, and I have no idea what it was, but he was kind of persona non grata. He got sent off to the Gulag in Siberia. But they had all these pictures with Stalin and this guy who's now like a horrible person that Soviet people should be angry at. Instead of acknowledging this and writing about it, they just edited the pictures, right? I mean, obviously they didn't have Photoshop back then, but they had ways to edit pictures, and they used it to edit these people out of these pictures. And so there are some pictures you can find where it'll be like Stalin and 4 other guys. And then you can find another copy from a few years later where it's Stalin and 3 other guys. Same picture, but they edited one out. Then a few years later, it's Stalin and 2 other guys. And then Stalin and 1 other guy. And they keep editing out the people that have kind of become enemies of the state and censored that information. And they would never, ever acknowledge from that point forward that that person had ever met Stalin. It was this big deal. 1925 in Tennessee, there was what's called the Scopes trial. Okay? Tennessee had recently passed a law about teaching evolution. And it was illegal in the state of Tennessee in the 20s to teach the theory of evolution. And this guy Scopes says, you know what, I'm a substitute teacher, I'm bored, I want to make a federal case out of this. So he gets called to substitute teach, starts teaching evolution, has a cop friend there just to arrest him and convict and arrest him and take him to jail for violating this law. And then they take it all the way to the Supreme Court, they have this trial in Tennessee. That's the important bit. And these 2 guys here, those were the opposing lawyers in the case. Both became wildly famous because of this case. Well, one of them was famous even before this case, but anyway. And they had this huge court case, very public, very kind of, the whole country was following it, about whether you should be able to teach the theory of evolution in a science class in a high school. And it was, does the government have the power to censor what is taught in the classroom? And should evolution be one of those things that's censored? Now, obviously, long story short, I'm hoping we all learned about evolution in high school, so we know who eventually won, right? 1960 in the UK, Penguin Books, which is a big book publisher, they went to trial for publishing this book called Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was this hugely popular book in the UK in 1960, but it was very risque, right? There's a lot of sex in the book. And what's funny is, funny kind of side note, my mother once read this book as part of a book club, right? So everybody, was this whole group of women, and my mother was one of them, and they decided to read Lady Chatterley's Lover. And so my mom found a copy that she had bought years ago and was reading it, and it seemed really mild to her. Like, she was like, wow, am I that much of like a 21st century woman? Like, this doesn't seem that bad to me. Like, there was passages in it where, like, and then the lady and her husband went off to bed together. And like, is that really that bad? And she'd go into these book clubs, and people were like, I couldn't believe how risque it was, especially for 1960. That was, this was probably late 90s at this point. I couldn't believe back in the 1960 they were saying all this stuff. And my mom was like, what are you talking about? Finally, it took her like 2 weeks to figure out that she was reading an abridged copy that she had bought in a Catholic bookstore. I love that story. But Penguin Books got taken to trial in the UK for publishing this book that had a lot of sex in it. And essentially Penguin Books won, thankfully, and was able to publish this book that had a lot of sex in it, and didn't get punished for, publishing this book. 2003, here in the United States, there was an entire court case about whether school libraries could ban the Harry Potter books because they were evil and unchristian. And essentially the courts came down on the side of free speech and said, look, you can't ban books from libraries just because they are, you think they are against your religion, okay? You're a government school, so we can't pick sides with religion. B, if you want to ban a book from a public school library, you have to show like real, actual harm. Like a book about how to make a bomb or something, absolutely, you can ban those. That is a real demonstrable harm from children reading those books. Books like Harry Potter, if people don't want to read that, if that is a violation of their religious beliefs, they're free to just not read it. But you don't get to make the choice for everybody that nobody can read it. We have to leave that up to either the students themselves or the parents of the students. But we'll come back in just the next subsection and talk a little bit more about censorship, freedom of speech, freedom of information. It'll be a good one. See you then.